Howdy folks, and welcome to Saddle and Sixskin. Are you ready for a story that'll take you back to the grit and grandeur of the Old West? Before we get started, don't forget to give us a like and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming tales of the American frontier. Now, settle in, pour yourself a cup of coffee, and let's ride. The desert, you see, has its own way of talking, a language whispered on the wind if you just know how to listen. Margaret Cain had lived beneath those unforgiving skies long enough to decipher it. She could hear the restless silence that always preceded a dust storm, understand the subtle shift in the cries of the scavenger birds, and sense the uneasy pacing of her livestock when something unseen pressed upon the air. Living out here, you learn to pay attention to the little things. It might just save your life, wouldn't you agree? For 3 long days, her dog, Rex, had been acting peculiar, not sick, not lazy, just wrong. Every morning at the first light of dawn, that hound would plant himself right at the fence line, staring out toward those barren flats. He wouldn't touch his food, wouldn't even glance at the calves, and wouldn't so much as blink when Margaret called him. He just stood there, stock still, waiting for something that she couldn't see. It put her on edge, wouldn't it you? You know, sometimes dogs sense things we just can't perceive. That morning, everything changed. He didn't wait. When she opened that cabin door, Rex bolted like a bullet, kicking up dust as he ran. Not toward the stream, not to those scrub hills where jackrabbits like to dart about. No, he tore straight into that lifeless wasteland. By the time she had her mare saddled and ready, he was just a speck, swallowed up by the heat haze. Margaret urged her horse after him, a sense of unease growing with every hoof beat. Do you have a faithful friend like that, always looking out for you, even when you don't know you need it? If you do, give us a like. Now, Margaret was already burdened with debts that felt heavier than lead, the bank's deadline fast approaching, her herd thinned out by rustlers, and the well near dry. She couldn't stomach one more loss. Not Rex. The tracks pulled her west, through sand that seemed to swallow sound itself. At last, she found him. The hound wasn't running anymore. He circled something massive, half buried in the dunes. It was the locomotive, an old train engine lost and forgotten in the middle of nowhere. Every settler in the territory knew about that rusted giant. A blackened iron beast, stranded in a place no railroad had ever touched. No one could ever agree on how it got there. Some whispered about a runaway engine from some forgotten line. Others spoke of a ghost train, swallowed whole by the desert itself. The old-timers, they told stories, then clamped their mouths shut like the words themselves carried curses. Margaret had never dared venture this close until now. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, about all the mysteries the desert holds close to its chest. Now, if you're enjoying this story, why not hit that like button and maybe even subscribe? It helps us keep these tales of the Old West coming your way. It's just a little way to say thanks. Rex was pawing at the wheels, growling low in his throat. She rode down slowly, her rifle resting across her lap, her pulse thudding in her ears. Those brass fixtures on the engine caught the sun and threw daggers of light across the dunes. That's when she noticed the marks in the sand. Not animal tracks, but boot prints. Fresh boot prints. Her stomach clenched tight. Someone had been here, circling, pausing, searching. Not days ago, but hours, maybe even less. Rex, she called out, her voice echoing strangely, bouncing off the black hull of that engine. The dog vanished behind the tender car. That's when Margaret saw the panel, and everything changed. A section of that side plating had shifted, ajar. Blackness gaped where no darkness should be. The boot prints led straight to it. She dismounted, rifle at the ready, her heart pounding in her chest. She had a bad feeling in the pit of her stomach, but she had to know. Rex barked from the other side of that machine, sharp and furious, nothing she'd ever heard from him before. And on the horizon, a dust cloud rose. Riders were coming, folks. At least 3 of them, riding hard, riding with purpose. Margaret's throat went dry. No one came out here by accident, did they? She pressed herself against the iron hide of the engine, her breath shallow and ragged. Those riders thundered closer, their horses driven to a breaking pace. Rex crept back to her side, his hackles spiked high. 3 riders, maybe 4, and they weren't just drifting. They were coming straight for that engine. The lead man wore a long, black duster, sitting his saddle with the ease of a man who owned every inch of ground he crossed. The 2 behind him spread out, hands grazing the butts of their revolvers. They weren't just curious travelers, that's for sure. What do you think they were after? Tell us what you think in the comments. Now, the lead man reined up about 50 yards out and studied the engine. His face was rough-hewn, his beard streaked with silver, and his eyes cut like flint. Margaret Cain, he called out, his voice carrying clear across that open air. No need to hide. We've been expecting you. Her blood ran cold. They knew her name. I don't know you, she called back, leveling her rifle, just in case. He grinned, a thin, cold smile. Name's Victor Brandt. Maybe you've heard it. She had. Brandt was a shadow, traded in whispers. A fixer, a hunter for hire. Folks said he worked for those Eastern investors who bought up land cheap after misfortune struck. Misfortune that often looked a whole lot like sabotage. Ever get the feeling someone is watching you? This is my land, Margaret said, her voice steady, even though her hands trembled. And you're trespassing. Brandt just chuckled. Your land? You've got 3 weeks before the bank says otherwise. Her stomach twisted. How did he know? My employers are interested in this patch of desert, Brandt went on. He gestured toward that hulking engine. Particularly that. Rex snarled, stepping forward, ready to protect her. What do you want? Margaret asked, her voice tight with worry. I want you to forget you ever saw this, Brandt said smoothly. You walk away. Maybe your debts get handled. And if I don't? One of his riders shifted in his saddle, his fingers tapping on the iron of his revolver. Then you have an accident, Brandt said flatly. A woman thrown from her horse. A body found days too late. That's how the desert keeps its secrets, folks. Margaret held his gaze, fury burning beneath her fear. Seems to me, she said, if you could open that thing, you'd have done it already. So why do you need me? Brandt's smirk thinned. His eyes sharpened. Because it's locked, he said. And the key wasn't destroyed like it should have been. Someone close to you kept it. Margaret froze. Your late husband, Brandt said, and her breath caught in her throat. Daniel Cain had been gone 2 years, laid beneath that dry earth with a headstone she couldn't afford to carve. He'd worked for the railroad before they built this ranch together. Bookkeeping, manifests, the dull paperwork of commerce, or so he had always claimed. You're lying, she said, but the words rang hollow even in her own ears. Brandt just shook his head. Daniel handled cargo records, secure combinations. He kept something. We know it, and now you have it. Rage flared up in her like a wildfire. You went through my home. We searched, one of Brandt's men said with a grin. Didn't find it, but we know it's there. Margaret leveled her rifle square at him. Try stepping foot inside my cabin again, and I'll gut shoot you myself. The grin vanished quick. Brandt's tone hardened. Where is it, Margaret? The code, the ledger, whatever he took. We need it, and you're going to help us find it. Rex growled, low and savage. His gaze was fixed not on the men, but on the engine itself. Margaret turned. That panel had shifted wider, groaning in the heat. What secrets did that engine hold, and would Margaret be able to keep them? Something inside caught the sun. Not rust, not brass. A glint. silver. Brant's eyes lit up. Well, now, he murmured. Would you look at that? One of his men dismounted, pistol in hand, and crouched down beside that opening. He leaned in and whistled low. Boss, you need to see this. Brant swung down from his saddle and strode forward, leaving the third man to keep a bead on Margaret. Rex bristled, his growl deepening. Margaret kept her rifle steady, even though sweat stung her eyes. Brant knelt, peered inside, and his breath caught in his throat. 15 years, he whispered, his voice thick with awe. And it's still here. What is it? Margaret demanded to know. Brant didn't answer her at first. Then he turned, and his smile was like a knife. 47 sealed containers, he said with his eyes lit up with greed. Each packed with silver ingots bound for San Francisco, worth more now than when they disappeared. Margaret's knees went weak. Silver enough to buy 10 ranches, enough to turn enemies into executioners. The stakes had just gone up considerably, hadn't they? Brant stood tall again, his men tense with hunger. Here's how this goes, Mrs. Cain, he said, his voice cold and menacing. We're riding back to your cabin. You're going to dig out what your husband left. Because without that code, those containers stay sealed. Try to force them open, and the contents are destroyed. Margaret's heart thundered in her chest. They needed her. Needed Daniel's ghost, his scraps of paper, his secrets. For now, that meant she had leverage, and she would have to use it for all it was worth. She took a breath, masking her fear. If I help you, she said slowly, I want to see what's inside first. Every last ingot. I won't play blind. Brant studied her. Then, after a long beat, he nodded once. Fair enough, he said, but once you've seen, there's no going back. You'll be in this, whether you want to be or not. Margaret stepped forward, her rifle tight against her shoulder. Rex pressed close to her leg. She bent down to the panel, with the sun at her back, and she saw for herself rows of iron boxes stacked neat, stamped with markings she recognized from those freight yards, government seals, bank insignias, the kind of cargo men would kill for, worth more than life itself. Now, did she make the right choice? Her throat went dry as she stared into that black compartment, and she understood that whatever choices she made now would decide not only her future but whether she lived to see another dawn. The desert sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across that half-buried machine. Margaret Cain kept her rifle tight in her hands, but she knew the balance of power had shifted. Victor Brant and his men weren't here by chance. They'd come for this moment, timed it to the day, and though Margaret's fear threatened to break her, she understood one thing clearly. She was the only piece they needed to finish the puzzle. Now, how was she going to solve the riddle of her life? What would she do with the treasure that lay before her? Brant motioned toward the horses. Mount up, he ordered. We're riding to your cabin. You've got something we need, and I don't care if we have to tear your walls down to find it. Rex growled, the fur along his back stiff as bristles. Margaret laid her hand on his neck, steadying him. She forced her voice to be even. You don't set foot in my home unless I ride with you, she told them firmly. You'll get only what I decide to give. Brant smirked at her. You've got grit, he said with grudging respect. I'll give you that. But grit doesn't change facts. That locomotive, that fortune sitting on top of it, and the only thing standing between them, was a widow who owed the bank more than her land was worth. Margaret's jaw tightened. Then maybe I've got nothing left to lose. The smirk faltered, just a flicker, but Brant caught himself, and turned sharp. Bring her horse, he ordered. One of the men grabbed her mare's reins. Margaret climbed into the saddle, with Rex pacing close beside her. They rode out together, and the engine's hulking silhouette shrunk behind them, in the setting sun. Margaret cast one last look over her shoulder. The panel gaped wider now, with the heat groaning against the iron. The desert itself seemed restless, like it knew that old secret had been stirred awake. Now, what do you think lies in store for Margaret and her faithful companion? The ride back to her cabin was long, and the silence was heavier than the desert heat. Brant rode ahead, his posture easy but watchful. His 2 men flanked Margaret, one always with a hand near his revolver. Rex trotted close, his steady presence her only comfort. As they neared her land, Margaret's thoughts churned. Daniel's papers. She hadn't touched them since his death. She couldn't bear it. They sat in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, bundled with letters and deeds, smelling faintly of him. Could there truly be something hidden there? Something worth all this madness? That cabin came into view, small and worn, but still standing defiant against the wind. Brant slowed his horse and scanned the horizon. Now that the cabin was in view, what did her husband have in that cedar chest? Quiet little spread, he said, almost wistfully. Shame it won't be yours much longer. Margaret ignored him, dismounted, and shouldered open the door. The smell of wood smoke and old paper greeted her, bittersweet in her nostrils. Rex padded in first, his tail stiff, sniffing at every corner, like he expected danger to be lying in wait for her. Brant followed without hesitation, his boots heavy on her floorboards. His men fanned out, one to the table, and the other to the shelves, rummaging through her things. Margaret spun on him, rifle lifted, pointed straight at him. I told you, you don't touch a damn thing, unless I say. For a moment, tension hummed like a drawn bow, strung tight. Then Brant raised his hands in mock surrender. All right, Mrs. Cain, he said slowly. Show us where it is. Her chest ached as she crossed to that cedar chest. She knelt, her fingers trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside lay the life she had buried, Daniel's handwriting on the envelopes, his careful notes on scrap paper, the deed to their land, and the bills they could never seem to pay on time. Beneath it all, was a bound ledger she hadn't noticed before, its edges worn, the pages filled with precise columns and figures. Her throat tightened. Daniel had never shown it to her. She lifted it out slowly. Brant stepped closer, his eyes sharp. That's it, he breathed out. Margaret met his gaze. This is all I've got, she told them. She knew nothing more. But Brant snatched that ledger and flipped through its pages with greedy fingers. What did that ledger contain and why did the others want it so badly? His brows furrowed as he scanned rows of numbers, codes, and dates. Then, his lips curled into a satisfied smile. He kept everything, he breathed out. Combinations, shipment records. It's all here. Margaret felt her knees weaken. Daniel, her Daniel, had been a part of all this. Or had he simply been careless, keeping his work papers like they were grocery lists? Brant snapped that ledger shut and tucked it inside his coat. Good, he said. Now we've got what we need. Margaret stiffened. And me? What happens to me now? Brant studied her, then shrugged. That depends, he said. You're clever. I'll grant you that. Maybe there's a place for you in this deal. Or maybe we cut you loose once the job's done. Either way, you've got no choice but to ride along. Now, did the widow make the right decision of trusting Brant? The following morning, long before dawn had colored the sky, they set out again for the locomotive. The desert was cool, and the stars were sharp and bright. Margaret rode with a hollow ache in her chest. She couldn't stop wondering. Had Daniel known? Had he hidden all of this from her? Or had fate twisted his innocent work into a noose that was now tightening around her neck? When they reached the ridge, that horizon was no longer empty. Another dust cloud was in view. Larger this time. Brant cursed under his breath. Not today. The riders came into view within minutes. 6 of them this time, finely dressed despite the desert heat. Their horses gleamed, their saddles tooled and polished. These weren't men of the frontier. These were men of money. Would this be the end for Margaret Cain? One of the riders dismounted as they approached. He was a thin man with pale skin and sharp eyes. He walked with the precision of someone who had never begged for anything in his life. "Mr. Brant," that man said, his voice clipped and eastern. "You were instructed to wait for us." Brant straightened up, a flicker of defensiveness passing over his hard features. "Mr. Harrington, circumstances changed. That compartment opened on its own. We couldn't risk losing the opportunity." Harrington's gaze slid over to Margaret. He studied her like livestock at auction. "And this?" he asked. "She's the landowner," Brant said quickly. "And the widow of Daniel Cain, that bookkeeper who kept the codes. She had what we needed." Margaret sat tall, meeting Harrington's stare. "And what exactly do you want from me?" Harrington smiled thinly. "What we've wanted all along, access. That silver belongs to our investors. With your late husband's records, we can finally reclaim it." Margaret's stomach clenched. "And what do I get in return?" A flicker of amusement crossed Harrington's pale face. "You're in no position to bargain." "Try me," she said sharply. Harrington's smile faded. He looked at Brant, who shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, Margaret saw cracks in their unity. "She can help us open it," Brant said. "Without her, we risk damaging the contents. The railroad designed those compartments with traps." Harrington considered her, then nodded once. "Very well," he said. "You help us. You'll be compensated. 5% of the recovered value." Margaret barked out a harsh laugh. 5%? Of nearly 1,000 pounds of silver? That's just scraps. "Scraps that could save your ranch," Harrington said coldly. Margaret leaned forward in her saddle. "Then you'll want to hear my counter," she said. "Half, or I walk." Now she knew the amount of what was held within the railcar. Will she live long enough to see her riches come to her? Every man froze in place. Even Rex seemed to hold his breath. Brant's eyes went wide. "Woman, do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Margaret leveled her rifle at him. "I do," she said. "Men who can't touch that silver without me. Men who will slit each other's throats soon enough, if they don't get what they want. I'm the only thing keeping you from wasting another 15 years." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Harrington's expression didn't change, but his pale eyes sharpened considerably. 30%, he said finally. "Not a coin more. And if you fail, you get nothing but a shallow grave." Now, what would the widow decide to do? And who does she partner up with? Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to nod. "Deal," she said. They turned back to the locomotive. The panel had gaped even wider overnight. That desert heat prying it open like a fresh wound. Inside, those sealed containers gleamed faintly, stacked in patient silence. Brant opened Daniel's ledger and handed it to Margaret. "Do your part," he said. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages filled with codes. Her husband's handwriting stared back at her, neat and precise. She swallowed hard, and the ache of betrayal twisted deep inside of her. Now that she had access, would she follow through with their deal, or end it all right then and there? Rex pressed against her leg, steadying her. Margaret raised her eyes to all the men circling her. "You'd better all listen up," she said. "Once I open this, there's no going back. Every lawman west of the Mississippi will want a piece of this, and when they come, they won't care who had the codes, or who had the claim." Harrington's face hardened. "Open it," he ordered. Margaret drew a shaky breath, pressed her palm to the cold iron, and began working that sequence Daniel had scribbled in the margins, numbers that matched the dates that only she recognized. Their wedding day. The day their son was born and buried within hours. The day Daniel had signed the deed for their ranch. Her vision blurred with tears as she whispered that final combination. A sharp click echoed inside that compartment. Metal shifted. Locks disengaged with a sound like bones snapping. And then, that first container slid forward. Margaret pulled it into the light and cracked it open. Rows of gleaming silver ingots stared back at her. The men surged closer, gasping like thirsty animals at a well. Brant's face lit up with triumph. Harrington's thin smile returned. Margaret felt her heart sink like a stone. The desert had whispered its warning. She just hadn't listened, but she soon would. Now that the code worked, what did the future hold for all of them? The desert held its breath. Margaret Cain stared at that open container, those silver ingots gleaming in the sun like frozen light. Around her, the men who had once looked unshakable now trembled with greed. Their eyes darted, and their hands twitched near their pistols. Victor Brant let out a sharp laugh. Half disbelief, half triumph. By God, he said. 15 years, and it's still here. Harrington didn't laugh. He simply stepped forward, his pale face unreadable, and lifted one of those ingots with delicate hands. He turned it in the light, inspecting the stamp of the San Francisco Mint. Then he nodded once and slid it back into place. It's genuine, he said softly. Every bar untouched. All the men breathed out in awe. Margaret felt no awe, only dread. She saw it in their faces, the hunger, the madness that silver could breed. It wasn't just money. It was power. Whoever walked away with this hoard could reshape lives, towns, and counties, or bury them. Rex pressed even closer against her leg, his ears pinned back, reading the coming storm in the air. How much of this newfound wealth would she retain for herself? Harrington turned his gaze back to her. Mrs. Cain, he said, you fulfilled your purpose. The code works. From here, we'll take control. Margaret squared her shoulders. That wasn't the deal. You'll have your share, Harrington said coolly. 30%, paid once that silver is safely in Eastern hands. Until then, you'll remain under our supervision. Now, did Margaret expect them to keep up with their end of the bargain? Brant's lip curled up in a snarl. You don't trust me to finish this job? Harrington's eyes flicked over to him. I don't trust anyone, he said, least of all a man who's lost 3 ranches to cards and bullets. Brant stiffened. His 2 men shifted uneasily. Margaret saw the rift like a crack in glass, and she knew one hard shove might break it wide open. Would she stay and let this silver consume the lives of those there, or would she find a way to take it all and run, leaving everyone in the dust? Sounds to me, she said slowly, like Harrington doesn't need you anymore, Brant. He's got that silver, he's got the codes. Why split the haul with middlemen? Silence sharpened. Brant's hand drifted toward his revolver. Harrington's men, 6 of them, eased their hands onto the rifles slung over their shoulders. Brant's own 2 riders stiffened, their eyes darting nervously between the factions. Margaret's heart thundered in her chest. She hadn't planned those words, they just spilled out, instinctive and desperate. But now, she saw the danger in their truth. This wasn't about her survival anymore. It was about whether anyone survived once greed finished its work. Who would survive this showdown? That standoff broke when Harrington spoke, his voice as quiet as frost. Mr. Brant, you've done well. You'll be compensated. But this operation belongs to us now. Step aside. Brant spat in the sand at him. Like hell I will. And in a blink, guns cleared leather. The air shattered with the thunder of gunfire. Margaret dove behind that locomotive. Rex leapt right with her. Bullets screamed off the iron. Sand kicked up in stinging sprays. She clutched her rifle, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest, and the roar of gunfire was deafening. When she risked a glance, she saw one of Brant's men down, clutching his gut wound, his blood soaking the sand. Another one of Harrington's polished men sprawled lifeless, his hat blown clean off his head. It had begun. The fight for the stolen sliver was afoot. Brant himself crouched behind his horse, firing with steady precision, his face twisted with fury. Harrington stood out in the open, unflinching, barking orders with icy calm as his men closed ranks around him. Margaret pressed her back against the iron, breathing hard. She had no loyalty to either side. If she stayed here, she'd be caught between wolves. She turned to Rex and whispered, "We need to move, now." She slung that rifle over her shoulder and scrambled along the length of that locomotive, keeping low. Gunfire echoed all around them, and ricochets sang like angry hornets. How could she leave with Rex with her with so many men standing guard? She reached the far end of that locomotive, and pulled herself onto that ladder, and climbed the rusting steps. That cab was stripped bare, with glass long shattered, and the controls rusted stiff, but it gave her height, a vantage point. She crouched low, peering out. Below, the men screamed and cursed. Brant's last rider took a bullet in the throat and dropped. Brant himself returned fire, hitting one of Harrington's men, but the numbers were against him. Margaret's gut told her that he'd be dead in minutes unless she did something she didn't want to. She hated Brant. He had dragged her into all of this, threatened her life, and trampled all over her home. But Harrington was worse. Cold, calculating, the kind of man who'd strip her land bare and leave her bones to bleach in the dust. Brant might be a devil, but Harrington was the fire behind him. How could she make a decision so deadly? She hated both the men that stood before her with equal intensity. Margaret set her jaw tight, lifted her rifle, and sighted carefully. One shot cracked through the air. A man in Harrington's line staggered and dropped to the floor. Chaos rippled through the ranks. That balance of power shifted. Brant caught that opening she gave him. He surged up from behind his cover, firing fast, dropping another man. His eyes darted up and met hers for a split second. Recognition, and shock. Then, the barest nod. Enemies just a moment ago, now bound by necessity. The fight turned brutal. Gunsmoke hung thick in the air. Horses screamed, rearing up, as they tried to run. Sand ran red with blood. When the echoes finally faded, 5 men lay dead in the sands of the desert. 2 of Harrington's men remained standing, battered, but still on their feet. Brant crouched in the dust, bleeding from a graze at his temple, his chest heaving with the work of staying alive. Harrington himself stood untouched. His suit was dusted, but his face was as calm as carved marble. He turned his gaze up to Margaret. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Cain." She leveled the rifle right at him. "Feels like the only choice I've got." His lips thinned out with disdain. "Kill me," he responded, "and you'll have more trouble than you can imagine. My employers won't rest. They'll come for you. They'll come for your land. They'll come for whatever you think you've won." Brant staggered to his feet, his pistol shaking in his hand. "And if I kill you, Harrington," he declared, "your employers won't have anyone to blame but themselves." Harrington's 2 remaining men raised their rifles, but Margaret snapped off a shot that sent one of them sprawling. Rex lunged out from the shadows of the cab and brought the other one down in a blur of teeth and fury. Then, there was only silence. Only 3 of them remained standing. Margaret, Victor Brant, and Harrington. What choice could she make that would leave anyone alive, including herself? For a long, tense moment, none of them moved. The wind stirred the dust. The silver gleamed faintly in that dark compartment. Finally, Harrington spoke with deadly purpose. "You think you've won, do you?" he taunted. "Look around you. All that blood in the sand. Bodies rotting in the baking sun. Do you think the law won't come sniffing around? Do you honestly think you can hide 1,000 pounds of silver? Margaret's hands shook with nerves. He was right. Even if they buried every ingot deep in the earth, those rumors would spread like wildfire. Word would reach the towns. And the desert, in the end, never kept its secrets for very long. Brant snarled at him. "Just shut your mouth," he growled. Harrington only smiled thinly. "I'll make you both an offer," he stated calmly. "Spare me. I'll arrange a clean sale of the silver." Quietly. "No law, no loose tongues. You both walk away richer than you've ever dreamed of." Margaret felt the weight of that rifle in her trembling hands. Every choice hung before her like a hangman's noose. If she spared him, she'd be bound to a man she could never trust, not as long as she lived. If she killed him, she'd make an enemy of men whose reach stretched farther than any rail line. What was she going to do to free herself and make things right? Rex whined lowly, pressing close against her leg. The desert whispered again, and Margaret knew there would be no easy road out of this blood-soaked land. She knew she had a life-altering decision to make that could save or doom them all. The desert fell silent again, broken only by the ringing in Margaret Cain's ears. Bodies sprawled in the sand. Brant leaned against his saddle, bleeding and ragged, his pistol still held tight in his grip. Harrington stood tall and proud despite the ruin that surrounded him, his pale eyes fixed on Margaret with the patience of a spider, waiting for its prey. "You won't kill me," Harrington said softly. "Because you're not a killer." Margaret steadied her rifle on him. "You don't know what I am anymore." Rex growled low at her side, his fur matted with blood from the man he'd torn down. "You think you'll survive without me?" Harrington pressed. How could she know what the right decision would be? One wrong move and that would be the end for all of them. "The law will be here within days," he warned. "The silver will draw them like flies to honey. You can't bury it. You can't spend it. It will eat you alive." He spread his hands as if he were offering himself as a sacrifice. "But I can make it vanish, just like it never existed," he offered. "I can turn your 30% into coin in your pocket. Your land saved, all of your debts erased forever." Margaret's hands shook like the branches in the wind. Brant barked out a hoarse laugh. "Don't listen to him. Vultures don't just change, Cain. You keep him alive, and he'll gut you the second you blink." Harrington didn't flinch. "And you, Mr. Brant, how long before you put a bullet in her back and take it all for yourself?" he taunted. "Don't pretend to be noble now. You're nothing but a hired gun just clinging to the scraps that I threw you, like a dog wanting a bone." Brant's jaw tightened with rage. His pistol never wavered from Harrington. Margaret's pulse thundered through her veins. She had one bullet chambered in the rifle, and one shot to decide the future of all involved. Her mind spun back to Daniel, his laugh, his handwriting on that ledger page, the way he'd tucked their son's tiny blanket into the cedar chest before it became a coffin of memories, a constant reminder of the family they would never have. Had he known? Had he understood the danger he had left behind when he kept those ledgers hidden? Or had he simply believed the desert would keep his secrets forever locked in her heart? Now, she stood in the wreckage of all of that silence. "You both want me dead," she said, her voice raw, trembling. "The only difference is just how quick you'd make it happen." Brant said nothing. His eyes told her the truth she already knew. Harrington smiled faintly with dark satisfaction. "Then the smart choice is survival with me," he said with conviction. Margaret exhaled slow and steady. "No, I don't think so. The smart choice is mine." She squeezed the trigger. And the rifle roared through the desert air. Then there was silence once again. What did Margaret decide to do that caused the desert to fall silent again? Victor Brant staggered back, eyes wide with disbelief, then crumpled into the sand in defeat. For the first time, Harrington looked surprised by her action. "You killed the only man who could have helped you fight me," he spat out. "No," Margaret whispered, I just killed the only man who couldn't let go." The sun sank lower in the sky, casting shadows that bled across the dunes. Harrington adjusted his coat, smoothed the dust from his sleeve with a disdainful gesture. He seemed almost calm again, though his eyes burned with calculation. "You'll regret this, Mrs. Cain, you know," he stated. "But you'll thank me first, when you get all that sliver. We'll move the silver tonight," he continued. "My men in town will help. No one will ever know your name was ever tied to this sordid business." Margaret lowered the rifle, but her finger hovered near that trigger, just in case she needed it again. What a situation that was facing Margaret. "And when you're done with me?" Her voice shook a little as she asked the question that stood between life and death. "We'll see," Harrington said with a smile that was as thin and sharp as a knife. Rex snarled with warning, teeth bared, ready to attack. Margaret tried to steady him with a trembling hand. Her mind was racing a mile a minute. If she left Harrington alive, she would forever live under his dark shadow. If she killed him, his investors would come hunting her down, as relentless as a pack of wolves. There was only one way forward that she could take. She knew it now as she looked into the eyes of those that had tried to deceive her. "Rex," she whispered with a new resolve. The dog lunged in anticipation. Harrington barely had time to gasp before teeth sank deeply into his arm, dragging him down to the bloody ground. Margaret swung the rifle up, sighted it on his chest, and fired a bullet once. The shot echoed across the desolate desert. Harrington fell still. Silence fell upon the sands as the last man ceased to breathe. Margaret stood shaking now, that rifle slipping from her weak grip. Rex panted hard, his muzzle smeared red with blood, his eyes locked on her as if he was waiting for her next command. The silver gleamed brightly in the long shadow of the abandoned locomotive. Could she really?